Okay, well, I want to welcome everybody to this week's Neuroscience seminar. Our speaker today is Dr. Andrew Coward from the Australian National University. He's being hosted by Dr. Ilan Barinholtz, so I'll pass it on to Ilan so that he can make the introductions for his speaker.
Everybody, good afternoon, and a real pleasure to be here. It's my honor to introduce Mr. Andrew Coward. He comes from a somewhat unusual background for a systems neuroscientist. Many decades experience in the design and development of complex electronic systems, real-time electronic systems. And at some point in his career, he pivoted to taking that approach to designing systems, electronic systems, to trying to reverse engineer, the most complex real-time electrochemical system in the world, which is the human brain. And interestingly, because of that perspective, perhaps Mr. Coward brings a real systems neuroscience approach, perhaps the most comprehensive account of brain function from the macro all down to the neural level that I've encountered. And it's his recommendation architecture, which he's going to tell us a bit about today, is a very comprehensive account of higher level cognition. How do we perceive and then make decisions and act on those decisions? So without further ado, I would like to introduce Mr. Andrew Coward.
Thank you very much, Ilan. And hello, everyone. My talk today is going to be about how to approach the problem of understanding higher cognition in terms of what neurons are doing. And there's a lot of neurons in the brain, and we'd like to achieve an intuitively satisfying understanding of how the activity of these vast numbers of neurons results in cognition. And we want to do that just in terms of neuron activity, at least I'd like to. And remember that the only information available to neurons is that neurons connected to it are firing. And in particular, neurons don't have access to cognitive type knowledge. Now, there is another example of the same general type of understanding problem. In a high-end personal computer, there can be up to 100 billion transistors. And in the computing systems that design the control of the internet, the things like name servers, there can actually be trillions of transistors. And human beings understand these computing systems in the sense of being able to design them. So if you think about that design problem for a moment, the process for designing a computing system obviously can't involve an engineer simultaneously imagining the ongoing activity of all the billions of transistors. The information about the transistors has to be organized in such a way that every design task is within human mental bandwidth. Now, let me be quite clear. A brain is nothing like a computer. The information processes performed by neurons are completely different from the information processes performed by transistors. And the way neurons are organized in the brain is completely different from the way transistors are organized in the computer. But the way we go about understanding computers has some vital lessons for how we need to go about understanding the brain. We'll never be able to understand how a brain records and retrieves a memory, for example, by simultaneously imagining the activity of all the neurons involved. We need a way to organize information about the neurons in such a way that understanding is within our mental bandwidth. So, how do we address that understanding problem for computing systems? Well, this is a layout that connects about 10,000 transistors in one integrated circuit within a large system. Now, transistors can be physically similar to each other, but each transistor is connected to a different group of other transistors. Each of those transistors is connected to a different group of yet other transistors, and so on. So every transistor has a unique connectivity environment within the system as a whole. And the key point is that it's this unique connectivity environment that makes the computing system work. If you've got just one connection wrong in that layout, the system won't work. So the implication is that when you're thinking about designing a computer, transistors can't usefully be regarded as identical. And that's very different from the situation in physics, for example. When you model how a complex system changes over time in physics, you use differential equations. But to make those equations work in practice, you have to use one of two possible types of approximation. Either you just model one or a very small number of components, like particles perhaps, or if there's a very large number of components, you use the approximation that they're all more or less identical. Now, neurons are nothing like transistors, but although neurons have some general similarities to each other, almost every neuron is connected with a different group of other neurons. And each of those neurons is connected to other unique groups. And the unique connectivity environment of all the neurons determines how cognitive processes work. So once again, you won't be able to use formal mathematics to model how a cognitive process works. And so although brains are very different from computers, the difficulties in understanding them have some similarities. And furthermore, there's also a similarity in the type of problem they have to solve. Both types of system need to detect conditions in the information available to them and associate different conditions or groups of conditions with different behaviors. But they solve this problem in radically different ways. In the case of computers, all the conditions, the behaviors, and the associations between them are specified in advance by a designer. In the brain, most of the conditions are defined from experience, like the receptive fields of pyramidal neurons in the cortex, for example. Many of the very detailed behaviors, like muscle movements, are defined genetically, but important combinations and sequences of those muscle movements, like the ones we need for walking, for example, have to be defined genetically. And the associations between conditions and behaviors are largely defined by experience. But despite these fundamental differences, both types of system face the same general understanding problem: how to organize the information about billions of components so that the behavior of the system can be understood. So how do we actually understand how a computer works, the kind of understanding that allows us to design computers? Well, the way we go about it is any major process within a computer can be described in terms of the interactions between major modules like printed circuit assemblies. Now, the amount of information in a description like this is fairly small, and a process within the computer can be thought about from end to end at the same time. But these types of descriptions are only approximate. If you need a somewhat less approximate description, you have to shift to descriptions in terms of the components on a module, like different integrated circuits on a printed circuit assembly. A description in those terms is a bit more precise, but you won't be able to think about all the interactions between all the integrated circuits on every printed circuit assembly at the same time. The information density is too high. At this level, you can only think about a relatively small part of the computing process at one time. And furthermore, even this somewhat more detailed description is still approximate. To get even more precision, you have to shift to descriptions in terms of integrated circuits, in terms of integrated circuits sections on integrated circuits. For more accuracy, you have to shift to different cells making up one section on integrated circuit, to logic gates within one cell, and to transistors on one logic gate. And for the highest precision, you may have to think about computer processes in terms of how transistors operate, maybe even using quantum mechanics. Now, as you go to the deeper levels, the descriptions become more and more precise, but the information content goes up. So only smaller and smaller parts of an end-to-end process within the computer can be thought about at the same time. If you need to think about how the parts fit together, you have to shift up to a higher level. So to understand the system with billions of components, we've got to have a hierarchy of descriptions like this, with some sophisticated management of the use of approximation. If you have some familiarity with the different levels of description, and you can shift easily between them, you feel you have a good, intuitively satisfying understanding of the system. But all this depends on frequent translations between levels. And that could be a problem. Now, think about translating between different languages. That kind of translation can be messy and ambiguous at times. And a big part of the problem is that often there's no exactly equivalent concepts between two different languages. So why is straightforward translation between all these different levels of description possible? And the reason is that descriptions on every level are constructed in terms of just two general information processing types or concepts, the instruction and the data read-write. The instructions and data read-writes at high level are made up of combinations and sequences of instructions and data read-writes at more detailed levels, all the way down to combinations and sequences of machine code instructions and data read-writes. And beyond that to instructions and data read-writes like open the gate of that specific transistor or record data on those transistors. And it's the use of consistent information processing concepts that makes useful translations between the different levels of description practical. And why those two concepts? Well, they relate to the very high level description of a system that we talked about earlier, because the system needs to read and write conditions and associate conditions with behaviors. And in support of these two process types, all computers have what's called the instruction architecture. There's a CPU module that mostly specializes in instructions, memory modules that mostly specialize in data read-writes, and a range of interface modules that perform combinations of the two types. Okay, so what does all this have to do with the brain? Well, there are some practical pressures on brains that are exerted by natural selection. If two species need to learn roughly the same behaviors, but the brain of one species needs fewer resources, like neurons, that species will have a natural selection advantage over brains needing more resources. If when a brain of one species learned a new behavior, it often resulted in loss of the ability to perform some of the behaviors that had been learned earlier, a bit like catastrophic forgetting in artificial neural networks. Another species with a brain that learned new behaviors without forgetting the earlier behaviors will again have a natural selection advantage. And it's possible to demonstrate that natural selection pressures like these tend to constrain a system that needs to learn a complex combination of behaviors into a specific high-level architecture, vaguely analogous with the instruction architecture. And it's called the recommendation architecture. And it's got two major subsystems. One subsystem is a modular hierarchy that defines and detects conditions in the information available. And that information includes sensory information, but also contains information about the internal state of the brain itself. And at each point in time, some of the current condition detections are provided to a second subsystem, a component hierarchy, if you like. And each condition detection is interpreted by the component hierarchy as a set of recommendations in favor of different behaviors. And each of the recommendations made by one condition detection has its own individual weight. And the component hierarchy determines the behavior with the largest weight across all the currently detected conditions and implements it. So in fact, the practical considerations drive the existence of two types of information process in the brain: condition definition and detection, and behavior recommendation. Now, in the brain, the cortex is the modular hierarchy of condition definition detection, and subcortical structures, especially the basal ganglia, are the component hierarchy that manages recommendations. And if we look a bit more closely at this architecture, the cortex has a lot of different areas, and each area defines and detects conditions, or receptive fields they're called, on a different level of complexity. And different complexities are most effective for recommending different types of behavior. And I'll come back to that point in a moment. All the receptive fields are defined heuristically, and therefore they change over time. But these changes present a problem, because each cortical receptive field has a range of recommendation weights in favor of different behaviors, and when a field changes, the change can jeopardize the integrity of all those existing recommendation weights. If the field is detected in different circumstances, those recommendations may not be appropriate. So changes have to be very carefully managed to minimize that kind of problem. And as I'll discuss in a bit more detail later, the hippocampal system does that change management. And in the subcortical structures, the basal ganglia selects behaviors based on current cortical inputs. And parts of the basal ganglia select specific behaviors like motor movements. Other parts select more tactical or strategic behaviors. And now changes to recommendation weights also have to be carefully managed. So those kind of changes are also recommended by cortical receptive field detections and selected by the basal ganglia. So as I get into more detail in a moment, a lot of behaviors are implemented by release of receptive field detections into or out of cortical areas. And once a behavior is selected, the corresponding release is implemented by the thalamus. Now, that does beg the question of what exactly does release mean? Because all the axons are in place all the time. So any outputs a neuron in one area produces will be carried to its target areas. So what it means is that if a release behavior hasn't been selected, the outputs from different neurons are scattered in time. So when they arrive at a target neuron, they only reinforce each other fairly weakly. But if a release is selected, the thalamus places a 40 Hz modulation on the selected outputs. And as a result, the outputs from different neurons are bunched together in time, close to the peaks in the modulation signal. So they tend to arrive at target neurons close together. And being close together, they have a much stronger effect on those targets. So effectively, they've been released to those targets. Okay, so with a few additions I won't discuss today, this is the high-level architecture of the brain. And this architecture exists because of natural selection pressures. But as a side effect of those natural selection pressures, there are two general types of information processes going on in the brain. And the existence of these two types, the condition definition detection and the behavioral recommendation, mean that it's possible to create hierarchies of description that are analogous with, but completely different from the ones we use to understand computer systems. At the highest level, we can describe cognitive processes in terms of definition and detection of receptive fields in the cortex, subcortical interpretation of detections as behavior recommendations and implementations of the most strongly recommended behavior. And we can map descriptions of the condition definition detection processes through a series of more detailed levels of description in terms of cortical areas, cortical columns, layers within a column, neurons within a layer, the different dendrites on a neuron, down to terminal branches on a dendrite that define and detect groups of very similar conditions, and beyond that to chemical processes going on within the neuron. And we can do something similar with the behavioral recommendation processes in the subcortical structures. As we go to more detailed levels, descriptions become more precise, but have much higher information content. So to establish an intuitively satisfying understanding, we have to shift back and forth between levels. Okay, so now what I want to try to do is to give a bit of a flavor for what this moving between the levels means. Now, in the cortex, there are about 150 areas in each cortical hemisphere. And each area gets inputs from a small number of other areas, or in a few cases from one of the senses. And the area defines and detects receptive fields within those inputs. So the different areas define and detect receptive fields in different ranges of complexity, where what I mean by complexity is the total number of raw sensory inputs that contribute to the field definition, either directly or via fields in intermediate areas. And as I get to a bit more in a moment, receptive fields in one complexity range are especially effective for discriminating between different situations of a general type, where different situations have different behavioral implications. So receptive fields in different areas are most effective for recommending, in general, different types of behaviors. Well, to make that a bit more clear, I want to illustrate what discrimination means and how it relates to behaviors with a bit of an example. So these are the receptive fields that are defined and detected by neurons in different cortical columns in one cortical area of a macaque monkey. And within a column, the neurons tend to detect similar receptive fields. And in the monkey, this cortical area is important for identifying visual objects. But as you can see, the receptive fields don't exactly correspond with categories of objects that are relevant to a monkey. Any one receptive field might be detected in when looking at different types of object. So how does it work? Well, suppose this represents different cortical columns in one area of a human brain. And this area discriminates between different categories of visual objects. Now, each column defines and detects a different receptive field, vaguely analogous with the fields in the macaque brain. So what does discriminate mean? Well, when the brain's looking at some visual object, a group of receptive fields will be detected. But the group won't be the same even when looking at the same type of object on different occasions. Different groups may be detected depending on the exact visual appearance. So, for example, the receptive fields that I've colored in red in this case might be those that are sometimes detected when looking at different dogs. And each of those columns will have some recommendation strength in favor of different dog-appropriate behaviors, like saying that's a dog. Now, for any actual dog, only a relatively small subset of those receptive fields will actually be detected, and it'll generally be a somewhat different subset for each dog experience. Now, these are the columns in the same area that sometimes detect their receptive fields in response to looking at different cats. And once again, only a subset will be detected in any one cat experience. On the other hand, there could be some visual similarities between some cats and some dogs. So some receptive fields might be sometimes detected when looking at a cat, and also sometimes detected when looking at a dog. And these could be the receptive fields sometimes detected when looking at birds. And again, there could even be some visual similarities between some cats and some birds. A receptive field like that, which is one of those measured in the macaque brain, could be detected in response to seeing a larger body next to a smaller head, for example. And that receptive field could be detected in some dogs, some cats, and some birds. But in any individual cat experience, some subset of the receptive fields are going to be detected, and maybe all of them have been detected in the past in response to looking at cats. So those receptive fields will have some recommendation strength in favor of cat-appropriate behaviors. Some will also have recommendation strength in favor of dog-appropriate behaviors. And a few may even have recommendation strengths in favor of bird-appropriate behaviors. But effective discrimination for the area means that all the groups of receptive fields detected in response to instances of one category are sufficiently similar to each other and sufficiently different from the groups detected in response to different categories that it's possible to assign recommendation strengths in such a way that the correct behavior almost always has the highest total recommendation strength. Now, let me extend that a bit. Suppose you have a series of cortical areas. The top area gets inputs from the eyes and defines receptive fields within those inputs, and it passes any detections to the next area and so on. So each area defines and detects receptive fields that are combinations of the receptive fields defined in the preceding area. So the top area defines receptive fields able to discriminate between different elements in visual images projected on the retina. The next areas might define receptive fields able to discriminate between different features of visual images, between wings, tails, and so on. The next areas define receptive fields able to discriminate between different types of objects, like horses, mice, dogs, or humans, and so on. The next area can discriminate between different types of groups of objects, between a man riding a horse and a man putting a shoe on the horse, for example. And later areas discriminate between groups of objects. And for example, this might be a different groups of horses and people. They're similar, but in one case there's been a crash, so the behavioral implications are different. Now, it's important to bear in mind, though, that a receptive field in one area might be useful for guiding some discriminations that are mostly supported by another area, and it could acquire the relevant recommendation strengths. Okay, so natural selection has resulted in perhaps 150 areas in each cortical hemisphere, and they've been defined by natural selection in such a way that the cortex can discriminate between almost all situations that have different behavioral implications. So at each point in time, there'll be lots of receptive fields detected in different areas. Each will have a range of recommendation strengths, and the subcortical structures determine the behavior with the predominant recommendation weight across all those current detections. Okay, so let me say a little bit more about the different types of behavior that are being selected. One of the key types is release of receptive field detections. And attention behaviors are releases of selected sensory information into the cortex. Cognitive behaviors are releases of receptive field detections from one cortical area into another, for example, to discriminate between different groups of objects. Receptive fields detected within several different objects must be detected, and they must be brought together and together released into the groups of objects area. And motor behaviors, like body movements or speech generation, they are releases of cortical receptive field detections out of the cortex to drive muscles. So the second major type of behavior is making changes to recommendation weights. And these behaviors are also recommended by cortical receptive field detections and selected and implemented by the basal ganglia, with, in this case, the basal ganglia is acting on itself. So let me say a little bit more about releases between cortical areas. An important way to classify behaviors from a cognitive point of view is along a spectrum from strategic to very detailed. And if you take the example of a player in some team sport like soccer, a strategic behavior selection for that player would be to play defense rather than midfield or attack, say. And following selection of the strategy, a tactical selection might be to pick where to go on the playing field. A more specific selection will be to tackle a particular opposing player. A detailed behavior will be the body movements to set up the tackle. And very detailed selections would be the individual muscle movements. And different levels of behavior are implemented by releases from different cortical areas. So in the basal ganglia, there are components that correspond with different behaviors on different levels. Strategic behavior components are located in the ventral end of the basal ganglia and more detailed at the dorsal end. And in fact, at the very detailed levels, neurons or small groups of neurons actually correspond with moving one limb in one specific direction. Now, so the question is, how does selecting a strategic behavior influence the tactical behavior choices and so on? Well, think about a cortical area that can discriminate between different very complex circumstances in which different strategic behaviors are appropriate. In the soccer player example, that will be between situations on the field in which the most, and bearing in mind the recent past, in which the most appropriate behavior was either defense, midfield, or attack. And suppose that in some actual situation in the game, a range of receptive fields are detected in this area. The detections go to the different strategic behavior components in the basal ganglia. One strategic behavior is selected. Now, some subset of those receptive fields, I've circled them in green conceptually, will generally have most of the recommendation strength in favor of that selected behavior. And the implementation of the behavior is that those detections with the large recommendation strength are released to an area that discriminates between situations with different tactical behaviors are appropriate. And in that area, they contribute to the receptive field detections. So the detections in the tactical situations area will tend to be ones that have recommendation strengths in favor of tactical behaviors of the already selected strategic type. So in that soccer player example, if strategic defensive play had the predominant recommendation strength, the detections in the tactical situations area will tend to have recommendation strengths in favor of different tactical behaviors of the already selected defensive type, like moving to a certain area of the playing field. And the fields in that tactical situations area target components in the basal ganglia, and those components correspond with different tactical behaviors. One is selected, perhaps to go to one particular location, and once again, a subset of those fields have most of the recommendation strength, and it's those fields that are released to an area that can discriminate between circumstances in which different specific behaviors are appropriate, and so on. So more strategic behaviors are implemented by release of the cortical receptive field detections that recommended them to influence the receptive field detections that recommend more specific behaviors. But of course, neurons in the basal ganglia don't know about strategic or tactical behaviors in any cognitive sense. A selected behavior is simply a release of selected receptive field detections between specific cortical areas. So if I go back to the high-level architecture for a moment, I want to go into the receptive field change management function in a bit more detail. Now, as I mentioned, that's the role of the hippocampal system. And going back, repeating something I mentioned a little earlier, receptive fields are defined through experience, and so they constantly change. And the problem with those changes is that a receptive field has a range of recommendation weights associated with it. And if the field changes, in the future, the field may be detected in new circumstances and might not be detected when it was detected in the past. So the range of recommendation weights it had before the change may no longer be valid. So the question is, how can you minimize that kind of problem? Well, if a field is changed so that in the future it's detected in a few extra circumstances, but it's still detected in almost all the circumstances when it was detected in the past, that's a relatively low risk. And I'll call changes like that receptive field expansions. Okay, but another question is, when and why are changes necessary anyway? Well, to answer that, remember once again that receptive field detections only recommend behaviors. So to get a high integrity behavior selection, there should be a wide range of possible recommendations. And to make sure you get a wide range, at least a minimum number of receptive fields should be detected. So if only a few are being detected, in other words, if the situation is novel, there should be expansions to generate some additional detections. So where am I? Okay, so the final critical question is, if changes are needed, then which fields should be changed? And once again, you assert the receptive field is associated with ranges of recommendations. So to minimize undesirable side effects, any changes should be as small as possible. So the lowest risk option is to slightly expand the definition of some fields that are already close to being detected, so that they are detected as well. And of course, the fields that are already close to detection are generally more likely to have relevant recommendation strengths in the situation. And there is another criterion for expansion, that if a field has often expanded in the past, at the same time as some fields that are already being detected, it could be a better than average candidate for current expansion. So the role of the change manager is to determine when receptive fields need to be expanded, identify which receptive fields are most appropriate, and send signals to those receptive fields to drive the expansions. Okay, so how can the most appropriate fields be identified? What kind of information is needed? And the answer to that question is the reason there are columns in the cortex. Now, the cortex is conventionally viewed as having 6 layers, numbered with Roman numerals 1 through 6. And there are pyramidal neuron central bodies in all the layers except the first. And the pyramidal neurons are also arranged in columns, in which all of the neurons in one column have somewhat similar receptive fields. And there's a pronounced pattern of connectivity between the different layers in one column. Inputs from outside the column mainly arrive in layer 4. Neurons in layer 4 target layers 2 and 3, and 2 and 3 target 5 and 6. And the layers in 5 and 6, the neurons in layers 5 and 6 are the main outputs from the column. They target the basal ganglia or elsewhere in the cortex. So in this diagram, the layers are arranged in connectivity order rather than physical order. So if we think about the complexity of the receptive fields in different layers, input layer receptive fields are combinations of inputs to the column. Middle layers are combinations of the input layer receptive fields, and the output layer they're combinations of middle layer receptive fields. So the implication is that the receptive fields get a bit more specific as you go through the layers. In other words, the receptive fields in the input layer will probably be detected rather more often than those in the middle layer, and the receptive fields in the output layers will be detected the least often. So typically, if a column is detecting its receptive field, in other words, there are outputs from layers 5 and 6, there'll be activity in layer 4, a bit less in layers 2 and 3, and less again in layers 5 and 6. A column that's a long way from detecting its receptive field might still have some activity in the input layer, but nothing in the other layers. But if you think about that column on the right, that column has strong activity in layers 2 and 3, but no output, which implies that a relatively small expansion in the receptive field of this column would result in an output. So if receptive field expansions are needed, this column with strong internal activity but no output is going to be a good candidate. So the hippocampal system needs to be able to identify columns with strong internal activity. And remember also that expansion in the past, at the same time as some of the columns that are already currently detecting their receptive field, is also a potentially useful criterion. So how does the hippocampal system operate? And this illustrates the way in which inputs to the hippocampus proper are generated. Outputs from the middle layers of columns all across the cortex target cortical areas associated with the hippocampal system. And the receptive fields in those hippocampal areas correspond with groups of cortical columns that expanded their receptive fields at similar times in the past. And those fields are detected if there's strong internal activity in many of the columns in the group. Receptive fields in the entorhinal cortex therefore correspond with groups of cortical columns that expanded their receptive fields at similar times in the past. And the detections are passed to the hippocampus proper, and the hippocampus proper selects the very large groups of cortical columns that are appropriate for expansion. And the selections are mapped back through the layers 5 and 6 of the hippocampal areas to drive expansions in layers 5 and 6 of the most appropriate columns. And in this mapping process, the receptive fields in the hippocampal areas are updated to reflect the current expansions. So, how does the hippocampus proper carry out the actual selection process? And these are the key structures of the hippocampal formation and the connectivity between them. There are lots of pyramidal neurons in the two main CA fields, CA1 and CA3. And another part of the hippocampus proper is the dentate gyrus. And in the dentate gyrus, there's two types of neuron, granule cells and mossy cells. And all of these cells, pyramidal, granular, mossy, excite their targets. They encourage their targets to produce outputs. And there's also a key population of inhibitory neurons located in CA3. Now, the inputs from the entorhinal cortex indicate strong internal activity in groups of cortical columns. And those inputs go to pyramidal neurons in CA1, pyramidal neurons in CA3, and granule cells in the dentate gyrus. And all these populations develop receptive fields corresponding with extremely large groups of columns that have expanded their receptive fields at similar times in the past. Outputs from CA1 drive receptive field expansions across the cortex. Now, within the hippocampus, there's a really striking pattern of connectivity. First of all, there's a positive feedback loop in the dentate gyrus because granule cells excite mossy cells and mossy cells excite granule cells. There's also a positive feedback loop in CA3, with each CA3 pyramidal neuron excites lots of other CA3 pyramidals. And furthermore, there's a positive feedback loop between the two positive feedback loops, with granule cells exciting CA3 pyramidals and CA3 pyramidals exciting mossy cells. And the positive feedback is kept in check by the granule cells also targeting interneurons in CA3, and those interneurons in turn inhibit the CA3 pyramidals. Now, granule cells tend to target CA3 pyramidals with similar receptive fields, and they target those pyramidals both directly and via the interneurons. And another key point is that when granule cell activity is relatively low, the excitation of CA3 is larger than the inhibition. But as the granule cell activity increases, inhibition begins to predominate over excitation. Okay, so what does all this connectivity do? So think about a situation in which the circumstances being experienced by the brain are familiar. They're similar to lots of past circumstances. So because the circumstances are familiar, there'll be lots of receptive field detections all across the cortex. So there'll be strong inputs from the entorhinal cortex from all the different regions. Now, this strong input across the board will generate strong activity in all the granule cells. Now, so in the targeting of CA3, the inhibition will predominate over the excitation for all the CA3 pyramidals. In other words, CA3 will be shut down. So there'll be no outputs to CA1, and there'll be no cortical receptive field expansions, which is for this situation, that's what you need. Now, think about now, though, about there's some novel aspects to the situation the brain is in. The novelty means that there's going to be a bit lower level of receptive field detection in some cortical areas. And as a result, some inputs from the entorhinal cortex will be a bit lower. Now, the granule cells with receptive fields corresponding with groups of cortical columns across those areas are going to be a bit less active, therefore. Now, that will allow activity to build in the CA3 pyramidals with similar receptive fields. Now, as activity builds, the activity in the link from CA3 back to the dentate gyrus will increase. That'll increase the activity of the granule cells, and that will limit the increase in the CA3 activity. So the overall effect is going to be activity in CA3 that's proportional to the degree of novelty in the current situation, and the active CA3 pyramidals will be those with receptive fields corresponding with groups of columns with lower overall activity. In other words, the groups of columns where expansions are needed. Once the situation is stabilized, the CA3 activity is released to CA1 and onwards to drive receptive field expansions in columns with strong internal activity but no output. Now, so as required, the hippocampal system determines whether receptive field expansions are needed, identifies the most appropriate columns, and sends signals to those columns to drive the expansions, which adds the recommendation strengths of those columns to assist in determining current behavior. Okay, now finally, what I'd like to do is discuss some key additional mechanisms that are very critical for higher cognition. Now, suppose this represents the pattern of receptive field detections across multiple cortical areas. Now, each detection has its recommendation strengths. Basal ganglia determines the behavior. But up to this point, there's been a kind of implicit assumption that all the detections are ultimately within current sensory inputs. So only the recommendation strengths associated with those fields are going to be available. Now, human beings can actually plan for situations that bear almost no resemblance to their current sensory environment. Now, to support that kind of activity, how can the receptive fields with the appropriate recommendation strengths be activated when they're not there in current sensory inputs? And neurons don't know anything about cognitive categories or situations, so the brain can't just activate all the neurons relevant to a particular type of task. So at a neuron level, what information is available to support higher cognitive activities like planning? Well, neurons can know, if you like, whether they're active or not. And they can know whether other neurons are active at the same time. So it's possible for neurons to record information about past temporally correlated activity. And what that means is that if a group of neurons was active at similar times in the past, it could be possible if at some later time some members of the group were active, those active members could indirectly activate the inactive members on the basis of that temporally correlated past activity. And those indirect activations would make all the recommendation strengths of the indirectly activated fields available, even though those receptive fields weren't detected within current sensory inputs. So there are in fact 4 different types of temporal correlation that the brain could use. If a group of neurons are active at the same time on just one occasion, An indirect activation might be useful a short while later, but generally not if the environment of the brain has changed significantly. However, if a group of neurons is often active at the same time, an indirect activation on that basis is much more likely to be useful longer term. And even for a single period of simultaneous activity, if it occurred when there was significant receptive field expansion, a much later indirect activation might be valuable. And finally, prolongation of current activity in a group of neurons could also sometimes be important. So these four mechanisms support four of the different types of memory that have been observed in psychology. And once again, these mechanisms are available to neurons that don't know anything about cognitive meanings. Okay, so now I want to say a little bit more about how semantic memory is supported and also how episodic memory is supported. So first, indirect activation on the basis of frequent past simultaneous activity. Now suppose this represents the receptive fields directly detected in the same visual area of the cortex in response to 6 different experiences of dogs. And the receptive fields detected in each experience will be somewhat different. But because there are some visual similarities between different dogs, some receptive fields tend to be detected relatively often. Not in every experience, just relatively frequently. So it is possible to define a group of columns that I've indicated by the green arrows conceptually that have often been active at similar times in the past. Now, suppose that on each of these occasions, the word dog was heard and receptive fields were directly detected in the same auditory area. Now, once again, different receptive fields were detected each time, but because of similarities between the sounds, some receptive fields were detected relatively often. And again, a group of receptive fields often active at the same time can be defined. So because each time the visual and auditory experiences were simultaneous, there's a group of auditory receptive fields that's often been active at the same time as a group of visual receptive fields. So later, if the word is heard without the visual experience, a fairly high proportion of that auditory group will usually be detected, and that group could indirectly activate a significant proportion of the visual group on the basis of frequent past simultaneous activity. And the effect will be to make all the recommendation strengths associated with that indirectly activated group available. And those recommendation strengths could be, for example, in favor of verbal descriptions of dogs and so on. The subjective experience will be as if looking at a weighted average of past experiences looking at dogs. So indirect activation on the basis of frequent past simultaneous activity is the mechanism that can support semantic memory. Now, if there's a degree of novelty to an experience, even for a single period of simultaneous activity, there may be behavioral value in a much later indirect activation. So suppose a brain experiences a traffic accident. The novelty means that there'll be significant receptive field expansion in many different areas, the visual, complex circumstances, and so on. I'll mark the active fields with arrows, and I'm marking both those that expanded and those that were just detected without expansion. Now, suppose that later the words, "your traffic accident," are heard. From the words, there'll be an indirect activation on the basis of frequent past simultaneous activity, the semantic memory mechanism, and that will result in a population of receptive field detections in those same visual areas. But only a relatively small proportion of the fields active during the specific individual experience are indirectly activated, and I'll circle those fields in green. Not a high enough proportion to have a predominant recommendation strength in favor of, for example, a verbal description of the accident. But now, if the behavior of indirect activation on the basis of past activity in the same period of receptive field expansion is selected, it will drive activation of a population containing a much higher proportion of the fields active during the accident. And that population may have sufficient recommendation strength to drive a verbal description of the event. So this mechanism can support recall of specific individual events. In other words, episodic memory. Now, I haven't said much about mapping into very detailed levels of description, but what I want to do is give a tiny hint for how mapping to the level of neuron circuitry works. And I'll use the example of the hippocampal system. And this is the connectivity between a regular cortical column and a column in one of the hippocampal areas. Now recall that change management needs receptive fields corresponding with groups of columns that expanded their receptive fields at the same time in the past. But episodic memory, on the other hand, needs receptive fields corresponding with groups of columns that were active at the same time in the past during a period of receptive field expansion, but including both the fields that expanded and the fields that were active but weren't expanded. So the fields needed for change management and the fields needed for episodic memory are different, but use some similar information. So to economize on resources, both types are defined by different neurons in the hippocampal system. And the connectivity in that system has to define those fields in such a way that the similarity is exploited, but the two functions don't interfere with each other. And this is the kind of connectivity that can support that. I don't have time to get into details, but the key thing is that the two functions have to be implemented using only the kind of information that's available to neurons. You can't import abstract cognitive type information. So in summary, to understand a complex system like the brain, we need hierarchies of description. Natural selection pressures have constrained the brain into the recommendation architecture form, and this form results in the ubiquitous presence in the brain of two general types of information process. And as a result, it's possible to create the hierarchies of description that we need for understanding. And also it's possible to understand the information processes performed by anatomical structures and how they come together to support cognitive processing. And I want to make the final comment that this is a system understanding. Any one cognitive phenomenon is going to require processes performed by many or all different anatomical structures. It's meaningless to look for one anatomical structure or chemical process that's the place where some cognitive process is going on. And I published a number of papers on this approach, but really a book is needed to give the complete system picture. And these are the 4 books I published as the approach is developed. And this is an academic monograph with all sorts of references to the neuroscience literature, and it's the textbook for a course I teach. And this is an attempt to describe the system ideas in a more accessible way that's going to be published in the next couple of months. But still, it needs overall systems thinking. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that talk. Are there any questions that people in the audience would care to ask? Go ahead and activate your microphones.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, great. Oh, that was such an interesting and appealing view of how the brain works. It was amazing. And I guess I'm a philosopher, so one thing I would ask you is, as you've had so much time to reflect and develop this architectural picture, would you speculate about the inevitability of intelligent systems utilizing this kind of architecture, given that they are biological? I won't talk about AI, but if it's a biological system and it's evolved, in common evolutionary conditions, along the lines of how we evolved, would you say that this kind of a architecture is necessary for higher forms of intelligence?
Yes. I think that what I'd say was that the architectural constraints, and I've gone into those in quite a lot of detail elsewhere, but I think the key thing is that any system that has limits on the amount of resource it's got available and has to use those resources to learn a large number of different behaviors is going to be forced into this architecture. Now, if you've got lots of resources, or if you're only having to learn one kind of behavior or a small number of behaviors, it won't apply. But if you've got to learn a lot of different behaviors and there are constraints on your resources, it's going to be forced into this direction. And I think you can see this architecture in birds, even in the octopus, in reptiles. It's basically, it's there everywhere. And you can identify it because in the case of in mammals, you've generally got a basal ganglia, a cortex, and hippocampus. You've also got a cerebellum, which is, I haven't really talked about, but that's another piece. But you basically can see similar neurons connected in similar ways in the bird brain. So it's there. The architecture is right there. So yes, I would say and I think the same applies to an artificial intelligence system. Again, with the reservations that if you're not limited by resources, then you can do other things. But as soon as you start getting constrained by resources and you've got to do multiple different things, then you'll get squeezed into this kind of architecture.
Thank you.
Such a fantastic talk. Thank you so much. I'm so glad we got it recorded so I can watch this like a dozen times and go through it. I got to pick your brain earlier. I just had one quick question. If you were to try to implement or instantiate kind of the stuff, do you see it analog or digital is really at the end of the day, or something in between?
I think you can do it digitally, other than, of course, the sensory inputs. Well, maybe even those. Yeah, in a sense, I think that depends on how you define digital, but it's sort of I think that actually there's no problem with doing things digitally. And in fact, sometimes analog can get you very constrained into more specific things, and is less flexible to go into multiple different kinds of behavior. So yeah, I would say that it's perfectly possible to do this digitally. And in a sense, it's sort of a neuron either produces a spike or it doesn't. And all the action potentials are the same size. They're all 100 millivolts. So there's an implicit digitality, or that's the right word, in the information communication within the brain.
Fantastic. I know Elon was trying to get let back in. I think. Oh, there he is. He's back now. Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. Unfortunately, the system froze up just at the moment. I had a couple of questions I wanted to ask. I don't know what may have been covered already in the question session, but what is actually the appropriate scale at which you would define a receptive field such that you can actually specify that it's made a recommendation? Or neurons presumably don't make recommendations in any sense, right? And so is it in columns? Is it subsets within columns? What constitutes a receptive field such that it makes a behavioral recommendation?
Well, I think that how do you say that this goes back into using approximation appropriately, because if you like, I think that physically the recommendations are actually made by layer 5 pyramidal neurons in the cortex. Those neurons have synaptic strengths onto spiny neurons in the basal ganglia, and that's where the recommendation strengths are. So it's actually an individual neuron, a pyramidal neuron in layer 5 of the cortex, that it carries the recommendation strengths. Now, and the thing is, though, that because those are the synaptic weights. On the other hand, when you're thinking about the brain, sometimes because all of the neurons within one column have similar receptive fields, they generally there's some similarity in the recommendations they make. So you can use the approximation of a column having recommendation strengths. And that's a useful approximation when you're thinking about things, because sometimes it gets muddied if you have to think about too many neurons. But so it's certainly a good approximation. And of course, then you can also have at a higher level, you can have a somewhat greater approximation that areas recommend different types of behavior. But ultimately, it's physically instantiated by synapses between pyramidal neurons and spiny neurons in the basal ganglia.
No, I mean, so that's really the output layer, so to speak, and you could think of each one really. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's the output layer from the column, and that's the layer that's connected to the basal ganglia, layer 5.
But of course, right, our notion of understanding, if we were to just study the properties of that output neuron, output layer, we wouldn't really have the understanding that we would want in order to say construct such a system, is that because it's really in the preceding layers that the receptive fields are really being defined.
Yes, yeah, that's right. As you say, you sometimes have to step back to see what's going on to the column level, and then sometimes you have to go down very specifically to see what's happening at the synapse level.
Right. And a quick follow, completely separate question. It's something we touched on earlier in the day, which is in general, the loop, as you kind of defined it, is certainly sensory stimulus, externally generated sensory stimulus, creating some sort of receptive field activation, which leads to some sort of behavior recommendation. But what about sort of internal mental activity? And I'd mentioned language. So you can think about something that it's not in any way activating. It's not directly activating your external senses, but you can generate what seems to be something on the scale of full experience in some ways, right? So, and you're going to have receptive field, presumably activation, similar to as if you were to see it or to actually perceive it. So I'm wondering if within your model, where's there room for that kind of internally generated, maybe a little bit more top down, I guess we could say, activation?
Yeah, I think that I mentioned the 4 types of indirect activation, or the basis, on the basis of frequent past simultaneous activity, recent activity, current activity, and activity during a period of receptive field expansion. Now, if you like, in addition to that, it can be frequent activity shortly before or shortly after, because those are all possibilities, and they can be implemented with neurons. So basically, those indirect activation mechanisms. Now, I brought it back and said, well, simultaneous frequent past activity is the basis for semantic memory, but really, that's a label we put on things. In practice, you've got receptive field detections. Let's say they start off being driven by sensory inputs, and there's receptive field detections all across the cortex. Now, all of those neurons may have recommendation strengths in favor of indirect activation on some basis. And if the basal ganglia determines that this kind of indirect activation is the predominant recommendation strength, those indirect activations will occur. So you'll get a constant stream of indirect and then of course the indirectly activated receptive fields may have recommendation strength in favor of other indirect activations. So it can propagate down a long chain and really the reason for this in natural selection terms are that the information within current sensory inputs may not be adequate to generate the most appropriate behavior. So you go through this chain of indirect activations to try to create a population that has the appropriate recommendation strength in favor of that most appropriate behavior. So as you say, you can get long chains of indirect activation, and that's essentially the thinking process, or the stream of consciousness as well. And yeah, one other comment, if I just digress, not digress exactly, but I think that one of the problems is that as you go down the chain, you do an indirect activation, you get a new population. From that population, you do another indirect activation. From that population, you do another one. The danger is that by the time you've gone through a dozen of these, things are getting a bit fuzzy. You may get a very confused situation. And I think that that's the significance of language in consciousness, that what happens is that after you've gone a couple of steps and it's getting a little fuzzy, but what can happen is that what the brain can do is take the strongest recommendation in favor of speech. And they accepts that recommendation and maybe activates something in the auditory cortex, and then goes back. And because speech is a relatively narrow band of information, it's forcing it into a certain amount of meaning. And then the speech, the words that are indirectly activated, can then go back and indirectly activate a more meaningful, let's say, visual indirect activation. So essentially what's happening is after things get a bit diffuse in meaning terms after several indirect activations, and the use of the language step can pull things into focus again, which is why quite often with consciousness, apparently, according to surveys of people, it is often experienced as fuzzy periods punctuated by rather sharper images. and then maybe another fuzzy period, and then another sharper image. And it's basically that being pulled back into focus periodically.
Do we see some sort of linguistic activation immediately prior to the coming to focus, as you've kind of proposed?
Well, I don't know. That's hard to get at. I think it's quite often experienced as words when it comes into focus. So yeah, it can be words, and sometimes experienced as images. And yeah, so it's sort of it's hard to tease that out, I think, though, in terms of experiments.
Right.
There's a question from Craig. Craig, do you want to activate your microphone?
Sure. Hi, how are you?
Hi, Craig.
Okay, so hopefully I'm qualified enough to ask the question. I jumped on a few minutes into the call, but regarding visualization, so when you describe, through of
I'm not hearing anything.
Craig, you're dropping out.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I was wondering what the relationship is in regards to what we'd call visualization versus linguistics, and as far as that influences these neural pathways that could make recommendations. So does increasing visualization or visualizing a specific behavior have any direct influence with the circuitry that outlined, or is that a separate, mission that has an indirect?
Are you talking about imagining a behavior as a planning step?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or a rehearsal in anticipation of an environmental stimulus.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think that this you can map that into indirect activations of neurons. That it depends on where you jump into that, but essentially, if you go through a series of indirect activations that ends up with activating a population as though you were actually carrying out the action, and even if it's an imaginary action, if you've never actually done that, then you're probably going to end up requiring some receptive field expansions, because it's not something you actually experienced. But on the other hand, you can create a population as though you were experiencing it. As I say, using expansions, and then in fact, what you can, let's say you created that, then what you can do, you've imagined a situation, but then let's suppose that you use indirect activation on the basis of frequent past simultaneous activity recommended by that imagined situation. And what potentially that can do is to create a pattern of activation as though you're in a situation just after you've taken that action on the basis of averages over the past. Now, if that then had strong recommendations, positive recommendations in favor of a reward, then what could happen is that reward recommendation recommends recent behaviors, and the recent behaviors have been the indirect activations that led to the visualization of the situation. So what that means is it makes it more likely that you'll go through the process of imagining that situation in the future, which makes it more likely that you'll actually take action to get to that situation, because the recommendation strengths needed to take action, to take the kind of action that takes you to the situation, have been strengthened.
It's a form of reinforcing those recommendations then.
Yes. You've imagined the situation. You go through a series of steps to get you to a situation, imagining each of those steps, using just indirect activation on the basis of frequent activity shortly afterwards. So you're averaging over lots of different past experiences. You're taking pieces of past experiences to construct the imagined experience, and then if that, you can then do another indirect activation that tells you that, so you're imagining the consequences of that situation, And if that's a positive situation that's resulted, then that can end up reinforcing the process that got you to it. So
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Susan is still on. She
I'm
has
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you.
Oh, yes, just one other question. I was wondering if you could just give me a little bit more detail on how your account differs from the global workspace and related global neuronal workspace view.
Yeah, I think that, how do you say, if you've got no limits on resources, you can build a system and do whatever you want with any architecture you want. And I think that, in a sense, you can create a kind of functional model for what you want to have done to do, or what the system has to do, and then you can build something to do that. I think that in the global workspace basically comes up with a bunch of features of consciousness that you'd like, and then it builds. It tries to build something that has those features, but it doesn't really take any account on any constraints on the actual brain in terms of resources. So you may well be able to reproduce a lot of the phenomena of consciousness with a model like that, but it doesn't necessarily relate to what neurons are doing. In other words, you couldn't build that model with neurons. That would be my view.
I think that's a little hard on the view, actually. I mean, I took it, especially like Dehaene's work and Barr's recent work, that one of the key things that they were trying to do was actually deal with an explanation of how the brain is able to attend to data and do searches given real time, as well as the spatial limitations of the brain, the cranium.
Okay, I haven't looked at his most recent work, so I couldn't answer that. But as I say, I go back to my point that in the end, the brain is a system where neurons don't know anything about anything other than the activity of other neurons, and nobody is giving neurons instructions in what to do. You have to start off with the connectivity you've got, and the brain has to bootstrap everything. So, and my belief is, having based on the kind of arguments I haven't gone into, I guess, that I think that any system that's going to learn that kind of complexity has to have this architecture. And but as I say, if you haven't got constraints on resources, and maybe using trillions of trillions of transistors, you could build something pretty similar. But it's not as it might be rather excessive, and of course this timing question, how fast it would respond, and what information you have to give it in order for it to learn. But so I'm not sure I can answer any more than that. It's sort of I just believe that you're going to be forced into this architecture if you really got to learn something very complex.
Okay, I think Eliza has a question. Eliza?
Yeah, hi, it's Eliza. I was just wondering, I'm coming from a developmental background, so I'm wondering whether your take on the brain kind of considers the massive changes that we see early on in life in terms of brain structure, like the massive pruning that we see in the early years. We also have changes in frequency bands. If you're looking at EEG data for alpha wave activity, we get different frequency bands across development. I guess I was just interested if your research takes that into account, or explains why we see those changes.
I think in very general terms, I think that so one of the things I can say is that the brain has to bootstrap things. So it needs to end up with a bunch of receptive fields that can discriminate between different situations, and it can only define those out of experience. So it's basically a receptive field is really a bunch of circumstances that have tended to occur often in the past, and similar circumstances that have occurred often in the past. So it defines things that way. In order to define those things and hone in on, focus on things, maybe it starts off with a lot more connectivity than it really needs. And then when it finds a bunch of inputs that tend to recur at the same time, it can get rid of the other ones and just maintain those. So I think that's an element of development. I think another aspect of development is that a receptive field has a lot of different recommendation strengths when you're an adult. Now, those recommendation strengths are acquired over time, but the thing is that if a receptive field hasn't got all that many recommendation strengths, if it's early in learning, let's say, then it's not so bad making more significant changes to the receptive field. And so I think that you can see more drastic changes to receptive fields in a child or in a baby than you get later on. And because there's less risk, because they haven't yet acquired as many recommendation strengths. And I think one of the places that shows up, I suspect, is that in childhood amnesia, I think that you need receptive fields to activate episodic memories. But those, I think that in a child, the receptive fields are there, but because they haven't got as many recommendation strengths, they tend to change quite a bit as you get older. So in fact, you can remember what you did yesterday when you're 5 years old, or even 2 or 3 years old. But once you get to age 11, some of those early memories begin to fade away. And I think what is happening is that there's a lot more changes to receptive fields going on at that period when you begin to acquire to start off with. But then once you get a bit older, you stop. The changes are much more conservative because you've got much more recommendation strengths to lose. So that's why because the changes are much more flexible early on, you tend not to keep memories of those early events. So I think those factors are there in development, and also I think in learning speech, I think there's a genetic bias on certain connectivity for learning speech, and there's more than you need, if you like, and as the receptive fields get defined more sharply, a lot of the unnecessary or unused connectivity gets pruned away. But that's very general. That's sort of I've not really looked at development to any significant degree.
Okay, thanks.
I have a quick question to Mr. Coward. So I find that I'm working on reinforcement learning myself, and I see a lot of analogs in artificial system, like how different inactive activation of the receptive fields kind of cascades down to selection of new behavior. I kind of see that how it helps in like an analogous to gradient descent and all those things that is taking place. And one of the questions that I wanted to ask in relation with the recent models that has been generative models that has been proposed. One of them is a variational autoencoder, and in which there is like information is actually stored in a very latent space, which you can think of it as a dictionary. And I want to ask that whether do you think this system of groups of receptive fields in one layer compared to, and there's also a hierarchical layers of these receptive fields looking into groups and features and like minutiae of the information compared to high levels of complexity that they resolve and recommend to the system. So in that spirit, I'm trying to see that whether do you think this is similar to a variational autoencoder kind of system where the system has a dictionary of latent space where they store information in a very compact manner so that the system the artificial system can disregard the irrelevant features, and from that minimalistic space of the minimalistic latent space, they can generate enough information to do whatever they want. So that's basically the idea. Do you think that variational autoencoder kind of captures this cascades, this hierarchical system of receptive fields that's there, or do you think it's completely different thing that and it's not very analogous to that?
Okay, well, I think that one key thing is that if you have a dictionary, for example, that you're mentioning, the question is what meaning is assigned to the entries in the dictionary. Now, if they are clear cognitive meanings, then that's very different, because one of the key things is that I think I mentioned that you've got the receptive fields on different levels of complexity, but actually they don't no receptive field actually exactly corresponds with any category, any feature, anything cognitive, because the brain doesn't have a way of converging on those things. It's basically it's always a group of receptive fields, and some receptive fields turn up a bit more often, but no receptive field. There's no receptive field that always occurs when you're looking at a dog and never occurs when you're looking at another animal. It's always a degree of ambiguity. So if you talk about a dictionary where you're importing cognitive meanings, then unambiguous meanings, then it's quite different. But on the other hand, if your dictionary entries are ambiguous, then
they are ambiguous. They are arbitrary feature vectors that helps in resolving that. So I think that
it's analogous. In a sense, it's like principal components, for example, or those kind of things. They're in a sense they're similar, although to the receptive fields. Although there's also the issue of how they're created, because they have to be created. The receptive fields have to be created with no cognitive guidance. They're just on the basis of neuron activity.
I see. Okay. And there's another question that kind of came up while I'm discussing with Dr. Barinholtz, and one of them was like, I'm going to ask this question in relation to, like, can we look at this recommended system and infer, like, from this pattern of activities, like what policy or what strategy the agent is kind of taking action to, like what is the strategy that is being deployed. For example, in very rudimentary level of inverted encoding model that I used to work on previously, it was like, if I present a participant with circle at this location or at a different location, from looking at the alpha waves, I can detect that this is I can infer that he's probably paying attention to this location of the screen, or in this location, or this orientation of feature he's remembering, or whatever. So there's a very basic rudimentary level of information that we can extract using inverted encoding models. But I'm kind of curious that, like, are you aware of research works that has like looked into such kind of like strategies that are, so there are, you said there are hierarchical of strategies, right? There's a strategy, then there's tactile, then there's very minutiae of those things. So are you aware that what level people have able to, like, looking at the activity patterns of these cascades of neurons, can they detect like any policy or any strategy that is being deployed by the player or the human agent or whatever he's doing?
Well, yeah, I'm not. I think that what do you say? If you're thinking about something very generally, well, let's put it this way: if you're, I think a particular cortical area is quite often will contribute to certain general kinds of behavior, because it's recommending those kinds of behavior. Other cortical areas will actually recommend probably the same area, but maybe less than the main area, and so any area is going to be a little bit vague. But on the other hand, probably what you can do is, if you're observing the brain, you can say, well, this is probably the kind of behavior or the kind of strategy, if you like, that this person is imagining. But I think that if you try to drop below that level, I think the issue is going to be that the receptive fields basically chop up experience into chunks, and in such a way that every similarity chunks, in such a way that in every experience a certain number of chunks are always going to be developed, or always going to be detected. But the problem is that given the chunks, the way experience is chopped up depends on the person's experience. So even if you take a very simple example, suppose that somebody had lots of experience of dogs. So they're going to have receptive fields that can discriminate between dogs and other animals. But how are things being chopped up? Well, if you've got somebody who was raised in a home that had a pet dog, then they're going to have a lot of experiences of dogs and their own dog, they're taking other dogs for a walk. Now, the receptive fields that will be defined in their brain are probably very different from the receptive fields defined in the brain of somebody who only saw pictures of dogs in books. So, if you like, that means that when those two people see a dog, the actual receptive, the receptive fields don't correspond with each other. They haven't got two receptive fields in the two brains that are actually the same. So they're always going to be. So you won't be able to push it beyond very generalities. That this is the sort of thing they're thinking about, but tying it down to actual specifics, I think, is going to be very difficult because it's not transferable between brains. Now, of course, if you study one person's brain and say, well, these columns are activated when they look at dogs. So, and if I look at those specific columns, okay, they're thinking about dogs. But you can't transfer that to any other brain. It's very specific to the individual brain.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Are you skeptical of claims of Halle-Berry neurons or even oriented edges that we've defined, sort of done this backwards decoding, that these are what the neuron codes for? I mean, according to your account, that's just it's not appropriate, really. So a neuron doesn't encode for any one specific stimulus.
Oh, well, edges, no, edges, yes. I think that basically the area V1 in the cortex is pretty hardwired genetically to pick up edges. And in fact, it's interesting that V1, the area of V1 is not connected to the hippocampal system. In other words, it doesn't have any change.
It doesn't change, but dramatically, or certainly through life experience. But still, even there's this ambiguity problem even in a V1 neuron in terms of fully pinning down. This is its preferred stimulus, and this is what drives its typical response, because you'll have a tuning curve and across multiple dimensions that are all contributing to its spiking behavior, and therefore it still has in some sense the same ambiguity problem. It's just that a little bit, to our eyes, it looks kind of okay, a line of this orientation and this size and this speed. It looks awfully similar to, but really when you get down to those dimensions, it's still highly ambiguous, highly spread out.
Well, in a sense, I think what's happening there is that you have a V1 neuron, and you've got neurons, are they ganglions behind the retina?
Retinal ganglion.
Well, the ganglion cells detect a center surround contrast, and I think that what happens, I suspect what's happening, is that you get a number of those ganglion cells in a small area of the retina that connect to a V1 neuron, and that's genetically defined. But then what happens is that because there are often lines in our visual experience, then because there are boundaries around objects, among other things, then what will happen is that if a V1 neuron has got inputs from a number of different ganglion cells, then ganglion cells that are along a line will tend to be active more frequently than the ones off the line, so that the V1 will tend to end up with a receptive field that corresponds with one particular line, more or less randomly which line. But once it's tipped over towards one line, it'll tend to get more and more focused on that line, but not completely, because it's basically it's only working on the basis of frequent past simultaneous activity. So I think it'll tend to move to it, but the genetic definition tends to push it towards lines just by its initial wiring.
No, I'm just putting out, but even within those, they receive, it's not just the orientation of the line. It could be, it's going to be multiple dimensions that are all converging to define that response. So, and then in natural activity, you're not going to get peak, very frequently get peak output from that neuron. Probably it's going to be part of an assembly, but it's going to be encoding for a feature that, again, is kind of ambiguous. I still think the ambiguity is likely persists even at those stages. It's just more narrow.
Yes, I agree with that. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, we are at 5:30. I don't know. I think I'm gonna at this point call it so that folks who are have elsewhere to be can log off. Mr. Coward is going to be available for follow-up questions. If people want, they can contact him. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. This has been tremendous.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Fun to read.